My name is Marisa Marico, and I was a former mafia princess to one of the most feared crime families in Italy.
Italian police were busy Tuesday carrying out one of the biggest operations ever against the powerful 'Ndrangheta crime organization.
Italy's combat against organized crime has been pulled into sharp focus by what some are describing as the mafia trial of the century.
Most people have heard of the Italian mafia, the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, the Camorra in Naples, the legendary Godfather. But there's one criminal organization you've probably never heard of.
The 'Ndrangheta is one of the world's most powerful mafia groups, running huge sections of the global drugs trade.
Hidden in the mountains of southern Italy, they've built the most powerful mafia on Earth. They control 80% of Europe's cocaine trade. That's worth over $60 billion a year. They've infiltrated governments, corrupted politicians, and own legitimate businesses worth hundreds of billions.
Calabria has been defrauded, basically, by lazy politicians, which sometimes are way more harmful than mafias. They have created a feeling that everything bad that happens here is normal. Things don't work, it's normal. I can't find a job, well, it's normal here. So everything that goes wrong is somehow internalized as normal.
They operate in over 40 countries, from Australia to Canada, from Germany to South America. The 'Ndrangheta is now considered the most dangerous mafia organization in the world. And yet, most people don't even know they exist. Welcome to the real story of the 'Ndrangheta, the most powerful and most secretive criminal organization in the world. To understand the 'Ndrangheta, you first have to understand the place it came from. Calabria is the very tip of Italy's boot. It's one of the poorest regions in Western Europe, with some of the lowest incomes, the highest unemployment, and some of the most isolated villages in the entire country. For hundreds of years, Calabria was barely governed at all. The central Italian state was always distant, always weak, always corrupt. And when you live in a place where the government can't protect you, where contracts can't be enforced, and where justice doesn't really exist, you start looking to something else. In the late 1800s, police reports and court records began documenting something strange. Small, secret societies in the olive and vine-rich villages of Calabria, hierarchical, bound by codes of conduct, operating by their own rules. They went by many names: the Picciotteria, the Onorata Società, the Ndrina. In 1897, a court sentence in the town of Palmi actually found a written code of rules. It spoke of honor, secrecy, solidarity, and the absolute requirement of omerta, silence. By 1890, a court in Reggio Calabria described these groups as hierarchically organized and highly dangerous. The name 'Ndrangheta itself tells you something important. It comes from the ancient Greek word andragatia, meaning gallantry or manly virtue. To the men who built this organization, they weren't criminals. They were the most honorable men in the valley. That self-image, the idea that they were the real law, the real protectors, is going to matter a lot as this story develops. Here's the thing that makes the 'Ndrangheta completely different from every other criminal organization on the planet. Most crime organizations, the Sicilian Mafia, the Camorra, the Yakuza, they recruit based on loyalty and skill. You prove yourself, you get vouched for, you join the family. In the 'Ndrangheta, you don't join the family, you are born into it. Membership is almost exclusively based on blood. You are a giovane d'onore, a boy of honor, from the moment you can walk, and when the time comes, you become an uomo d'onore, a man of honor. There is no application process. There is no audition. As anti-mafia prosecutor Salvatore Buemi told the Italian Anti-Mafia Commission, membership is often acquired for the simple fact of being born into a mafia family. This is why the basic unit of the 'Ndrangheta is called an Ndrina, a family clan. There are around 100 of these family clans in the province of Reggio Calabria alone. Altogether, they're believed to encompass somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 active members worldwide. But what makes this system so dangerous, what makes it so difficult to penetrate, is precisely this reliance on blood. When law enforcement tries to infiltrate a criminal organization, they look for the weak links, the soldiers who are unhappy, the associates who aren't really family. the people who might flip. In the 'Ndrangheta, almost everyone is actually family.
So my father was the boss of our clan, and he was looked upon as a boss from our family down in southern Italy. A boss's child or another member of the family can only take over his role, obviously when he's dead or in prison. And even in prison, he's still carrying on the role.
Compared to the Sicilian mafia in the early 1990s, almost no Calabrian mafiosi have ever become state informants. By 2002, there were just 157 Calabrian witnesses in the entire state protection program. That number is staggeringly low, given the size of the organization. And it explains why the 'Ndrangheta operated for over a century in virtual darkness. There are ranks within each clan. Picciotti at the bottom, then Camorristi, then Santisti, then Vangelisti, who must swear an oath of dedication to a life of crime upon the Bible. Above them, the Quintino, and at the top, the Capobastone, the head of command.
Once a year, in September, the bosses of all the Ndrin converge on the sanctuary of Our Lady of Polsi in San Luca, a quiet mountain church, for what they call the Crimine. They report on the year's activities, they settle disputes, they elect a temporary representative. Bosses reportedly attend from Canada, Australia, and Germany, the whole world. It is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary criminal governance structures that has ever existed. But here's where things get even more interesting. Inside the 'Ndrangheta, there is another organization, a secret society within the secret society. It's called La Santa. Regular 'Ndrangheta members don't even know La Santa exists. Only the most senior bosses are admitted, and La Santa did something the rest of the 'Ndrangheta was strictly forbidden from doing. It allowed its members to build close relationships with politicians, judges, police officers, and civil servants. Some of those officials were even brought into La Santa themselves. The vehicle for this infiltration was often Freemasonry. La Santa members were permitted to join Masonic lodges, which in Italy had powerful networks reaching into politics and the judiciary. This was a radical break from traditional 'Ndrangheta code, which forbade any mixing with the outside world.
A Masonic meeting really has been relatively unchanged for a number of centuries. A group of 30 to 40 people will meet maybe 4 to 8 times a year for a couple of hours a night, and they will do primarily one of 3 ceremonies.
But it worked devastatingly well. In 2012, the first time in history, the entire city government of Reggio Calabria was dissolved by the central government due to suspected 'Ndrangheta ties. The mayor and all 30 city councillors were removed from office. In the same year, in Milan, the financial capital of northern Italy, a regional government housing commissioner named Domenico Zambetti was arrested. He had allegedly been paying the 'Ndrangheta to secure election victories and to win construction contracts for the 2015 World Expo. This wasn't Calabria, this was Milan. By 2019, when 300 people were arrested across Calabria in a single operation, one of those arrested was Giancarlo Pitelli, a prominent lawyer and a former member of Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia party. The 'Ndrangheta had not just infiltrated street corners, it had infiltrated the state. For most of its early history, the 'Ndrangheta stayed in Calabria. That changed in the mid-20th century for 2 reasons. The first was emigration. Hundreds of thousands of Calabrians left Italy in the post-war decades, looking for work, heading to Germany, Switzerland, Canada, the United States, and Australia. And wherever the families went, the Ndrin followed. Not as invaders, as the same families, just in new places. The second reason is darkly ironic. The Italian government, trying to weaken the mafia in the south, introduced a policy called soggiorno obbligato, mandatory internal exile. The idea was to take dangerous bosses out of their home villages and relocate them to cities in northern Italy, cutting them off from their networks. What actually happened? The bosses arrived in Turin, in Milan, in the industrial north, and built new branches there. In 1963, a man named Rocco Lopresti was exiled to Bardonecchia, a small alpine town in Piedmont near Turin. He was later joined by his cousin. Together, they took over the local construction industry. By 1973, the Italian Parliamentary Anti-Mafia Commission came to Bardonecchia, the first time it had ever investigated northern Italy. In 1995, Bardonecchia became the first municipality in northern Italy to be dissolved for mafia infiltration. The policy, designed to weaken the 'Ndrangheta, had handed them a European expansion. And then came drugs. In the 1970s, the 'Ndrangheta made a decision that would transform them from a regional criminal outfit into a global superpower. They got into cocaine. More specifically, they figured something out that nobody else had quite figured out yet. Cocaine was going to be the most valuable commodity in the world, and the best way to dominate it was to control the supply chain from end to end, from the farms in South America all the way to the streets of Europe. And they had something no other European criminal group had: family. Their diaspora network, Calabrian families in Canada, in Australia, in Venezuela, in Argentina, gave them trusted contacts in every major cocaine-producing and cocaine-consuming region on Earth. Italian investigators have estimated that approximately 80% of Europe's cocaine is controlled by the 'Ndrangheta and passes through the Calabrian port of Gioia Tauro. That single port, sitting on the Tyrrhenian coast of Calabria, became the gateway for the largest drug trafficking operation in European history.
The story began in 1995. On the 16th of September, the ship Concorde of the Martin Belt Transport Company sailed to the port of Gioia Tauro.
The numbers are almost hard to comprehend. By 2007, drug trafficking alone was generating an estimated 27 billion euros per year for the 'Ndrangheta. They did it through deep relationships with South American cartels. In Colombia, they were closely associated with paramilitary groups. In Brazil, they partnered with the Primeiro Comando da Capital, the PCC, the largest criminal organization in the country. That alliance allowed the PCC to expand into Africa and Asia, while the 'Ndrangheta got a reliable cocaine pipeline stretching from Sao Paulo to Rotterdam. In 2008, Australian authorities intercepted a container of tomato cans arriving from Calabria. Inside, 15 million ecstasy pills. At the time, the largest ecstasy seizure in world history. These weren't random criminals improvising. This was a supply chain more sophisticated than many legal businesses. On the night of August 15, 2007, 6 Italian men were shot dead outside an Italian restaurant called Da Bruno in the city of Duisburg, Germany.
6 Italian men are gunned down in a German industrial city. Police say the killings were linked to Italian organized crime.
They had just been celebrating a birthday. The attack was a professional hit. Multiple gunmen. The victims were shot at close range. The oldest was 39. The youngest was just 16 years old. German police were baffled. Italy was shocked. The story went international. What investigators eventually pieced together was that this was the European spillover of a war that had been burning inside a single 'Ndrangheta village in Calabria for years. The town of San Luca, widely regarded as the spiritual heart of the 'Ndrangheta, had been locked in a feud between 2 rival clans, the Pelle Romeo family on one side and the Strangio Nirta family on the other. The war had started over something as mundane as an incident at a carnival in 1991. Over the following decade and a half, that feud claimed dozens of lives in Calabria. And then, on that August night in Germany, it claimed 6 more. The Duisburg massacre was a wake-up call for European law enforcement. Until that moment, many governments had treated the 'Ndrangheta as an Italian problem. The bodies on that German pavement made it impossible to pretend anymore. German investigators subsequently discovered that the 'Ndrangheta had been operating in Germany for decades. According to the German Federal Criminal Office, by 2009, there were an estimated 900 people involved in 'Ndrangheta activities in Germany, running restaurants, investing in real estate in the former East, laundering money through hotels, and legitimate businesses along the Baltic coast. In fact, the head of the German Federal Police, Jörg Zierke, said something remarkable. He said, "Half of the criminal groups identified in Germany belong to the 'Ndrangheta. It has been the biggest criminal group since the 1980s. Compared to other groups operating in Germany, the Italians have the strongest organization." The biggest criminal group in Germany since the 1980s, and most people had never heard of them. Beginning in the 1970s, 'Ndrangheta clans began abducting wealthy individuals from northern Italy and holding them for ransom in the mountains and valleys of Calabria, terrain they knew intimately, terrain that was almost impossible for outsiders to search. It is estimated they were responsible for over 200 kidnappings between the 1970s and mid-1990s. But the one that brought the whole world's attention, even if people didn't know who was responsible, happened in 1973. John Paul Getty III, grandson of J. Paul Getty, at the time one of the richest men on earth. The 16-year-old was snatched off the streets of Rome in July 1973. His kidnappers demanded $17 million for his return. His grandfather, famously, initially refused to pay, reportedly saying that if he paid for one grandson, he'd soon have 14 grandchildren kidnapped. Then, in November, a newspaper received a package. Inside was a lock of hair and a human ear. J. Paul Getty paid $2.2 million. His grandson was released in December, alive but deeply traumatized. The kidnappers were linked to the 'Ndrangheta. Most of the world reads this story as a wild crime story involving a reckless billionaire. Almost nobody mentioned the name of the organization responsible. That invisibility, the ability to commit spectacular crimes without the public ever learning your name, is perhaps the 'Ndrangheta's greatest achievement.
In May 2018, a news report summarized something Canadian law enforcement had known for decades. Quote, "Siderno's old world 'Ndrangheta boss sent acolytes to populate the new world." The first significant 'Ndrangheta figure to arrive in Canada was Michele Racco, who settled in Toronto in 1952. He established what became known as the Siderno Group, named after the Calabrian town from which most of its founding members came. By the 2000s, Toronto had become one of the most important 'Ndrangheta outposts in the world, not just for Canada, but potentially for the entire organization. Alberto Cisterna of Italy's National Anti-Mafia Directorate explained the appeal. Canada's banking system is very secretive. It does not allow investigation, so Canada is the ideal place to launder money. And then something happened that surprised even Italian investigators. In July 2019, Canadian police executed Project Sindicato, the largest organized crime bust in Ontario history. Around 500 officers raided 48 homes and businesses across the Greater Toronto area. They seized 27 homes worth $24 million, 5 Ferraris, and millions in cash and jewelry. They arrested the man they described as the head of the 'Ndrangheta in Toronto, Angelo Figliomeni.
Last weekend, over the course of 3 days, we executed 48 warrants on businesses, cafes, and residents in Vaughan and the GTA.
But during the press conference, an Italian state police officer said something striking. He said that the investigation had revealed something new. The 'Ndrangheta families in Canada had become so powerful, so established, that they were now making decisions that went beyond Canada. Decisions that potentially superseded even the authority of the mother clans back in Calabria. The colony had become more powerful than the empire. Now, those convictions were later stayed after legal challenges over improper wiretapping, but the picture of the organization that the trial painted had already been told to the world. In January 2021, something extraordinary happened in a specially constructed courtroom in the city of Lamezia Terme in Calabria.
more than 300 people stood trial for membership of the 'Ndrangheta. It was described by prosecutors as the second largest organized crime trial in Italian history, surpassed only by the Sicilian Mafia's famous Maxi-Trial of the 1980s. The defendants included not just street-level criminals, but politicians, lawyers, and businessmen. Among them, Giancarlo Pitelli, former member of parliament and one of the country's most prominent criminal defense lawyers. Prosecutors had spent years building the case. Chief Prosecutor Nicola Gratteri, widely considered the most important anti-mafia figure in Italy today, described it as a generational moment. In November 2023, the verdicts came. Over 200 people were convicted. Despite more than 100 acquittals following the 3-year trial, the result was described as a historic blow to the organization's activities in Europe. But even Gratteri himself would tell you, this is not the end. The 'Ndrangheta has survived assassination attempts on its leaders, military crackdowns, the dissolution of its allied governments, and international arrest waves. It has survived everything thrown at it for over 150 years. Because it is not built on individuals, it is built on families. And you cannot arrest a family. On February 21st, 2018, a young Slovak journalist named Jan Kuciak was shot dead at his home. His fiancée, Martina Kushnirova, was killed alongside him.
Sorry, Kubo, druhou stranu.
At the time of his murder, Kuciak had been working on a story about Slovak connections to the 'Ndrangheta. 1 week after his death, the news website Actuality.sk published his last unfinished article. It detailed how Italian businessmen with documented ties to the 'Ndrangheta had settled in eastern Slovakia, spent years siphoning off European Union development funds, and had built relationships with high-ranking Slovak government officials. One of those officials was a close advisor to Prime Minister Robert Fico. Another was a deputy and the secretary of the State Security Council. Both officials took leave of absence on the same day the article was published. The murder sparked mass protests across Slovakia. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, the largest demonstrations the country had seen since the fall of communism. The government eventually fell. Kuciak's killer was eventually convicted in 2023. But the deeper questions his reporting raised about how deeply organized crime had embedded itself in the political structure of an EU member state, those questions have never been fully answered.
And in Spain, where investigative journalist Jesus Duva, editor-in-chief at El País, has acknowledged Spanish media rarely reports on the 'Ndrangheta at all. Not because there's nothing to report, but because there's so little information available. The 'Ndrangheta benefits from silence, and it knows how to enforce it. In June 2014, Pope Francis stood before a crowd in Calabria and said something no pope had ever said quite so directly. He condemned the 'Ndrangheta as an organization that worshipped evil and showed contempt for the common good.
Those who in their lives follow this path of evil as mafiosi do, he said, are not in communion with God. They are excommunicated.
He said that mafiosi were excommunicated from the Catholic Church. Now, a Vatican spokesperson later clarified that this wasn't a formal, canonical excommunication, but the symbolic weight was enormous. Here's the irony. The 'Ndrangheta has always presented itself as deeply Catholic. Their rituals reference scripture. Their meeting place, the Sanctuary of Our Lady of Polsi, is a genuine place of religious pilgrimage. For generations, 'Ndrangheta bosses have sat in the front pews at church on Sundays and donated generously to local parishes. This fusion of organized crime and religious identity has been one of the most powerful tools of social control in Calabrian history. It made the 'Ndrangheta look legitimate. It made it look protective. It made it look like part of the community. And despite the Pope's condemnation, despite the trials, despite the arrests, in many parts of Calabria, the 'Ndrangheta is still, to many people, simply the way things work. That is the hardest thing for outsiders to understand. This isn't just a criminal organization. In the places where it's strongest, it is the state. Here's the part most people don't understand about the 'Ndrangheta. The cocaine and the kidnappings and the guns, that's only half the story. The other half is what happens to the money. The 'Ndrangheta has become one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations in the world. The profits from drug trafficking don't just sit in bags, they get cleaned, invested into the legitimate economy, and then those legitimate businesses become the foundation of the next cycle of crime. Restaurants in Germany and Belgium, hotels along the Baltic coast, real estate in Brussels, where the 'Ndrangheta once purchased almost an entire neighborhood with laundered drug money, supermarkets and construction companies in Italy. Olive oil businesses are exporting fraudulently labeled products to the United States. In 2017, 33 people were arrested in Italy and Germany connected to the Piromalli clan. The alleged scheme? Exporting cheap olive pomace oil to America, labeled as premium extra virgin olive oil, an Italian-American agricultural fraud worth millions. The 'Ndrangheta has also reportedly infiltrated renewable energy, wind farms and solar projects, using public subsidies as a vehicle for laundering money. They have been found in waste disposal contracts at the Ilva steel plant in Taranto, in greenhouse production, in funeral homes. There is almost no sector of the Italian economy where their presence hasn't been documented. In 2022, as part of a joint operation in Spain, police seized over 300,000 euros in cash, drugs, and firearms, and identified a criminal network that had been using Spanish real estate to launder the proceeds of drug trafficking. And those are just the operations that got caught. A 2010 US diplomatic cable, later published, estimated that the 'Ndrangheta's illicit activities accounted for approximately 3% of Italy's entire GDP. 3% of the GDP of the 8th largest economy in the world. From one criminal organization, from one region of one country. So here's the question that's been hanging over this entire story. How? How has an organization this large, this profitable, this violent, and this globally connected managed to stay so invisible for so long? The answer is several things working together. First, geography. The 'Ndrangheta came from one of the most isolated, poorest, and most overlooked regions of Western Europe. Nobody was paying close attention to rural Calabria. The Italian state barely had a presence there. Second, structure. The 'Ndrangheta is not organized like a corporation with a single boss who can be arrested and bring down the whole thing. It's a federation of independent family clans. You can arrest a boss. His sons carry on. His cousins carry on. The family carries on. Third, silence. The 'Ndrangheta has produced almost no informants in 150 years. You cannot build a prosecution without witnesses. And witnesses require people willing to betray their own family, which, in 'Ndrangheta culture, is effectively unthinkable. Fourth, strategy. Unlike the Sicilian Mafia in the 1980s, which became famous for spectacular violence against judges, journalists, and politicians, the 'Ndrangheta has generally avoided direct, overt confrontations with the Italian state. They prefer corruption to confrontation. They prefer to buy a judge rather than kill one. Fifth, and perhaps most damning, the world just wasn't looking.
As Jesus Duva, editor at El País, acknowledged about Spain's coverage, Spanish media rarely report on the 'Ndrangheta due to limited information, which inadvertently benefits the mafia by keeping its operations under the radar.
Silence, in every form, has been their greatest weapon. In May 2023, a major joint operation across Italy and Germany involving over 1,000 police officers resulted in 138 arrests connected to the 'Ndrangheta.
The operation had taken 4 years. It involved coordinated investigations in Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. One of the tools investigators used was gaining access to the organization's use of encrypted communication platforms, EncroChat and Sky ECC, services the Ndrangheta had switched to during COVID-19 when they couldn't meet in person.
In August 2025, 3 Ndrangheta members were arrested in Ibiza, Spain.
Wanted by Italian authorities for drug trafficking and criminal organization charges. They had been operating in Catalonia and the Levante region for about a year. Spanish authorities had been monitoring the Ndrangheta's expansion since 2024, recognizing Spain's geographic position as a key gateway for the organization's growth in southern Europe.
In July 2025, the alleged leader of the Ndrangheta's operations in Latin America, Giuseppe Palermo, known as Pepe, was arrested in Colombia. And yet, despite all of this, prosecutors are clear-eyed about what these arrests represent. They are not the end. Because here is the fundamental truth about the Ndrangheta that every prosecutor who has spent their career fighting it will tell you. You can arrest a man. You cannot arrest a bloodline. The sons are already being raised. The nephews are already being taught. The daughters are already being married into alliances that will bind clans together for another generation. The Ndrangheta is not a criminal organization that happened to be built on families. It is a family structure that happened to become a criminal organization. That distinction is everything. The Sicilian Mafia built its reputation on myth. The Camorra built its reputation on spectacle. The Ndrangheta built its power on silence. And for over 150 years, that silence worked. Today, the picture is slowly changing. The 2021 Maxi-Trial, the global arrests, the encrypted phone intercepts. For the first time, law enforcement agencies around the world are starting to coordinate their efforts in a way that might begin to match the scale of the threat. But the Ndrangheta has survived the Risorgimento, 2 world wars, the Cold War, Italy's economic miracle, the rise of the internet, and every anti-mafia operation in between. It has done so because it has something that almost no other criminal organization in the world has: a shared identity that runs deeper than money, deeper than politics, deeper than fear. It runs through the blood. And as one former prosecutor famously put it when asked whether the Ndrangheta would survive the coming decade of crackdowns, he paused. And then he said, "It has survived every century before this one." If this story left you wanting more, and honestly, how could it not, hit subscribe right now, because this channel exists for exactly these stories. The ones that are too big, too complicated, and to fit into a headline.